This is a video lecture for Chapter 5 of the Criminological Theory textbook. This chapter and Chapter 6 deal with control theory. This lecture today is going to deal with some of the early influences in development of control theory. One of the things that's unique about control theory, and there are a few different versions of control theory. Control theory is a general category, just so you understand. There is no one theory called control theory. There are, again, 3 or 4 different theories that fall under this category. And the thing that's unique about these types of theories is the question that they ask. Because one of the things that you'll notice about a lot of the theories that we talk about, they essentially ask the question, what makes people commit crime? And, again, if you go back to strain theory, that's the question that's asked in strain theory, is that what is it that makes people commit crime? When we get to control theory, they ask a different question. They ask the question, what causes people to not commit crime? In other words, what is it that makes people conform to society's standards? Because when you look around, you can see that actually, getting away with some kinds of crime is actually pretty easy. But for the most part, people don't do that. And so, again, this is the question that is asked by control theorists. Why do people conform? One of the main assumptions of control theories is that crime is essentially fun and enjoyable. It can be rewarding, and when there are no controls present, you can pretty much get away with almost anything you want to get away with. But despite that fact, a lot of people still conform to society's norms. So going back to some of the very early work that was done on what we would call control theory, we can go back first of all to Durkheim. If you remember, Merton used Durkheim's concept of anomie to explain some of his ideas. Control theorists also kind of like this idea, because remember, anomie is kind of the breakdown of social bonds and norms in society, which kind of makes it so that everybody goes it alone and just does what they need to do for their own benefit. One of the ideas behind control theory is that it's this feeling of belonging to society is one of the things that causes us to conform. And so if you get into an anomic state where we don't feel like we belong to something, control theorists would argue that this idea goes very much along with what they are trying to articulate in their theories. And Durkheim would say that technology and the rise of capitalism, and this sense of competition that we have in our society, is one of the things that has led to this eroded sense of community and this lack of social bonds between people. In Durkheim's anomie theory, social solidarity, or this feeling of belonging, was really maintained by 2 sets of functions. One is what he called integration. And again, this is just this feeling that you belong and that you believe in the norms of society and that you're kind of working with your fellow citizens for some kind of a common cause. And it's this collective activity that gives purpose and meaning to the activities we go about from a day-to-day basis. So, again, this is, a kind of a form of control. Durkheim didn't call it control, but really it's the same idea that control theorists are talking about, that because we are integrated in society, we feel like we belong, we're part of something larger than ourselves, and so we conform to the norms of that group, or society in general. The second function is what he called regulation. And again, this is just a way to say all the sum of social forces that kind of cause us to be bound to abide by the social norms. And that can be a variety of sources that comes from, but just again these social forces that act on us from outside. And again, it could be formal types of things like law enforcement or government sanctions, but more often it could be just something like being embarrassed in front of your family or something like that. That's a social force that a lot of times causes you to conform to what you should do. In Durkheim's Anomie theory, he argues that the nature of man, or people, men and women, is a blend of really two things. And one is what he called the social self, and the other was the egotistic self. And the social self is that part of us that kind of is a product of our socialization in society, and the part of us that wants to kind of go along with the group and do everything that we're expected to do. The egotistic self is just kind of what it sounds like. It's that it's just the impulsive side of us that just kind of wants to act for our own benefit and be selfish, and doesn't really feel like there should be any limits on what we're able to do. So it's really the blend of these two forces, Durkheim would say, that kind of generates the nature of a person. The amount of influence that is in their life from this social self, and then also the egotistic self. Because usually the social self will restrict the things that we'll let ourselves get away with from an egotistical standpoint. Looking at some of the other influences on early control theories, they were also influenced by the social disorganization perspective, which, if you remember, came out of the Chicago School. And there are really two themes from the Chicago School that were central in the development of control theories. One is just the assumption and interpretations we have about human nature and why people do what they do in general. And the second one was the nature of the community. Looking at the conceptions of human nature, Charles Cooley, who was one of the researchers associated with the Chicago School of Social Psychology, he essentially said that people are dependent on other people. We don't just live in a vacuum and act on our own. We are dependent on other people for a variety of things. And he also argued that the family is really the primary group where we have interactions that kind of give us this feeling that we belong to something that's larger than ourselves. Sometimes it's pretty hard for us to feel like we belong to a neighborhood or community in general, but really our families are where we get that first sense of belonging to something that is larger than ourselves, according to Charles Cooley. There was also what was referred to as the looking glass self, and this is just an idea that was talked about in regards to how we develop our self-concept. And what's argued here is that a child develops their concept of who they are by imagining how other people see them. So, and this is not, I don't think, too much of a stretch. We oftentimes probably consider what other people think of us, and this might generate some ideas we have about the kind of people we actually are. In looking at the characteristics of communities, it was this decline in moral integration with primary groups that really became important to the development of control theory, because it suggested that not only were communities disorganized, But there was this level of personal disorganization. If people had problems in how their self-concept developed, they had these problems at a very personal, individual level that would cause, defects in their behavior. One of the earliest control theorists was Albert J. Reiss. And he attempted to predict juvenile delinquency by looking at personal and social controls. So you can see, based on what we've talked about up to this point, where he is drawing those concepts from. This issue of personal control was what he called the ability of a person to refrain from meeting their own needs that would conflict with the norms and rules of society. Social control was the ability of social groups to enforce norms and rules that people would actually abide by. So again, his control theory was centered around this idea of personal control and social control, and it was the combination of these two that would predict your likelihood of engaging in delinquency. Reiss essentially said that delinquency results when there is kind of an absence of internalized norms and a breakdown in previously established controls, and there's an absence of or a conflict with social rules. And conformity, on the other hand, would result when a person accepts the rules of society or submits to them. So they don't necessarily have to agree with them, but if a person is willing to submit to these rules and norms that society enforces, then they were much more likely to be a conformist rather than do things that we would consider deviant. So according to Reiss, when you look at this from the perspective of the person, social control really lied in the acceptance or submission to the authorities of society and the reinforcement of existing personal controls by institutional controls. So that was really kind of the main theme that runs through his theory, was just this idea of submission to the norms of society. Now, from the other standpoint, which is the standpoint of the group, Reiss would say that control lies in the nature and strength of the norms of the institutions and the effectiveness of those institutions in obtaining the desired behavior. So again, with Reiss, we're looking at control on the personal level and also on the social level. So in this, in the theory that Reiss came up with, he essentially argued that the delinquent peer group is a consequence of the failure of personal and social controls. So it's not really all one or the other. There are some failures at the personal level, but there are also failures at the societal level that create these delinquent groups. And before you could really predict delinquency, you had to be able to assess this failure to submit to social controls, because he argued that really was the key predictor of delinquency, was this failure to submit to social controls. He also said that delinquency and delinquent repeat offending, or recidivism, can also be viewed as a consequence of the failure of primary groups to provide children with the appropriate socialization and social control. And again, this goes back to the family in a lot of ways, but he identified key groups as being responsible for this as the family, the neighborhood, and the school. And you actually see this through a lot of the different varieties of control theories, that these institutions are consistently identified as being important in providing the social control that children need to learn the norms of society and to develop the self-control to adhere to them. The family really is a key one, but if the family fails, then it's expected that neighborhoods and school influences can somewhat pick up the slack. But really the family is one of the key institutions that we see in research over and over that really is very important in determining how kids turn out and what their likelihood is of getting involved in delinquency. Moving on from Reiss, we will now talk a little bit about Walter Reckless. He was another well-known early control theorist, and the theory he came up with was called containment theory. And we'll explain why he calls it that in a minute. But essentially, he talked a lot about this concept that he called resiliency. And all this really means is, people who, despite, being in a situation that we would kind of assume would lead to their involvement in crime, they don't get involved in crime. And, so again, it's just this idea that conformity is actually much more common than deviance. And he calls, he noted that there are some people who face a lot of risks of becoming delinquent, but that don't, and he called this concept resiliency. And so really the central problem for this theory, or any theory, is in explaining differential responses of people to the same situations, because you could have two people in highly criminogenic situations, in terms of their family life and their economic position and all those things, and their groups of friends, and some will go down the wrong path and others just won't. And there's not really a great way to explain that, but if you could explain that, then you would probably have all the answers for everything. But this was the question that Walter Reckless dealt with. In his containment theory, Reckless talked about what he called pushes and pulls. And again, this is kind of similar to some of the other concepts we've talked about already, where we've talked about personal level controls and societal level controls. This is kind of similar to that. But if you look at table 5.1 in the textbook, you can kind of get an idea of what he's talking about here. Pushes would be things that would kind of, again, push people into a life of crime. And these would be things like your biological makeup, maybe your psychological makeup, and the social conditions that you find yourself in, like poverty, or maybe you have a particularly dysfunctional family situation, or something like that. So those kinds of things were what he called pushes. And then there were also what he called pulls, which were things that kind of entice you into crime. It's not something that's part of your natural makeup, but just kind of think of it as temptations. Maybe you've got delinquent friends, and they're trying to get you to do some things with them that you feel like you probably shouldn't do. That would be a pull. The pull of your friends kind of trying to get you involved in this kind of stuff. And so, but the observation that Reckless made, that I've kind of already mentioned a couple of times, is that despite the fact that people are subjected to all kinds of criminogenic pushes and pulls, conformity is still by far the most common state of affairs that we find. It's still relatively few people are delinquent or criminal compared to the society in general. So now, to get to why Reckless's theory was called containment theory, Reckless conceptualized two different kinds of containment. There was what he called outer containment and inner containment. And again, this is very similar to the idea of personal controls and social controls. Inner containment were things contained within a person, characteristics they had that would either prevent or lead them into crime. Outer containment are those social pressures that would either keep us out of crime or perhaps push us into it. But Reiss argued that it was this combination of outer containment and inner containment that prevented us from committing crime. Because remember, again, the question they're asking in control theory is, why do we conform? And Reiss's answer would be, well, we conform because there's this combination of outer containment and inner containment that is keeping us from breaking out and engaging in a life of crime for our own personal enjoyment. So really, again, this theory is talking about the risk of being delinquent, and Reiss would say that as your containment weakens, whether it's the inner or the outer or a combination, your odds of nonconformity would increase. Getting more specific about these ideas of outer and inner containment, if you look at Table 5.1 again in the textbook, it gives a little more explanation as to what Reiss really meant by these constructs. And looking at outer containment, he really stressed the establishment of reasonable limits by the norms of society, people having meaningful roles and activities that made them feel like they were a part of the group. And then there are a lot of other variables that go along with that he measured. You can take a look at that in the book and see what exactly he was talking about. Looking at factors of inner containment, and again, these are internal kinds of ideas to the person, not external pressures. But he had these key factors here that are listed. These are some of the things that Reiss highlighted that he thought were important. Having a positive self-concept, and having kind of a goal orientation so that your life had a sense of direction, and again, he emphasized legitimate goals. There are a lot of illegitimate goals you could set, but a direction towards legitimate goals. Your frustration tolerance, and again, this ability to cope with frustration is important, and there you can kind of see, that's an idea that crops up in strain theory, but that's a different thing altogether. But he talked about this frustration tolerance as being, one of the factors of our inner containment. The more easily frustrated you are, the more likely you are to be deviant, to accomplish your goals. And then there's norm retention, and this is just the acceptance of society's norms and rules, and also the acceptance of the legitimate means to accomplish the usual goals of society. So again, you can see some influence here, probably from some other theories, but this is how these ideas fit into the framework of a control theory. Moving on to another couple of researchers who were noteworthy, we're going to talk about Sykes and Matza. They are most noted for their contributions to what we call neutralization and drift theory. And again, these were just other ideas that they came up with to try and explain delinquent behavior. And what they tried to explain is, again, this idea of conformity. This is why their theory really falls under the umbrella of control theory. Because what they looked at is that even if you look at the most delinquent kids you can find, they are actually, in many other ways, pretty normal, conventional people, and they conform in a lot of other ways. It's very rare for someone to be a deviant in every aspect of their life. So they noted that you have these delinquent kids, and again, most of these early theories just centered on juvenile delinquency. So you had these delinquent kids who did a lot of deviant things, but in a lot of other ways in their lives were actually pretty conforming. And so they were interested by this, that how could you have someone that's so deviant in one area of their life, but then be so conforming in other areas? of their lives. And also, they wanted to evaluate why law-breaking behavior really tended to cease after a certain age. And if you remember from other classes you've had in criminology, you've probably heard discussions about the age crime curve. If you draw a graph that charts someone's delinquent behavior over the course of their lifetime, it increases as you get older up until the age of about 16, 17 years old, and then it starts to decrease. And even the most delinquent kids, as they get older, into their 20s and 30s and even later into their 40s and 50s, you see a dramatic drop-off in law-violating behavior. And so they wanted to investigate this phenomenon of why do we see so much delinquency at young ages, and then such a dramatic drop in delinquency as even those very delinquent kids get older. One of the ideas that Sykes and Matza came up with was this idea of neutralization, and they call these techniques of neutralization. Now you have to understand that inherent in this theory, if you kind of dig into some of the assumptions behind it, is that they assume that that there are these moral norms of society, and that most people have a commitment to these moral norms. And people know right from wrong, and they most of the time do the right thing, but sometimes they don't. And so what Sykes and Matza were essentially saying with their neutralization theory is that if you have this strong adherence to the norms of society, then delinquency should be very rare. Instances in which delinquency occurs is when we have somehow allowed ourselves to detach ourselves from those moral norms in society. And it was through these techniques of neutralization, neutralizing our moral commitments, essentially, that would allow delinquent or deviant behavior to occur. So all techniques of neutralization really means, it's just a fancy phrase for making excuses. That's all it really is Sykes and Matza came up with this list of excuses, if you will, that people give for why engaging in delinquency is okay, and why violating the norms of society was okay in their situation. And so when we talk about techniques of neutralization, that's all they're really talking about, is just how people excuse their poor behavior. And one of the reasons this is key is because if we can make these excuses and convince ourselves that they're true, then we are free to be deviant without actually rejecting the norms of society. I mean, if we steal something, but we have a good justification or rationalization for it, well, now we've explained why our case was special, and that we're not rejecting the norms of society. We were just a special case that made it okay for us to do this. Now, that's not necessarily true, but if the person can believe that in their own mind, that's what allows them to participate in these delinquent activities. So here are the 5 techniques of neutralization that Sykes and Matza came up with, and we probably have all engaged in these techniques of neutralization at some point in our life to excuse something that we did that we know we probably really shouldn't have done. So again, these aren't hard to understand. If you look at Table 5.2 in the book, it gives a more detailed explanation and example of these. But denial of responsibility is just the idea that hey, that wasn't my fault. I was abused, and so that abuse caused me to do whatever, or my friends were pressuring me, and so I did it. It wasn't really my fault. So you just blame somebody else or some other circumstance, and then you're absolved of responsibility. The second one is denial of injury. And this is just where you say, it really didn't hurt anybody, no big deal. And that's pretty much it. You just say, it was just a prank, or he's got a lot of money, so that $100 I took from his wallet, that's not going to hurt him. He doesn't care. So you just deny that any injury was actually done. The third one there is denial of the victim, And this is just really where you say, whoever the victim was of whatever you did, you say, hey, they deserved it. That was, they weren't really a victim. People sometimes may, and again, you could use one or any combination of these excuses for, to justify almost any behavior. But, someone may shoplift from a Walmart, for example, and say, Walmart, they just write off the loss, and they're a big company with a lot of money. They're not really a victim. They deserve it anyway because they charge high prices, and so I should be able to walk out with some free stuff every once in a while. Stuff like that. 4 is condemnation of the condemners. And this is just really where you just kind of turn the blame back on the people blaming you. And I saw this all the time when I was a police officer. I might, find somebody doing something wrong and lock them up, and, they might say something to me like, oh, well, you're just arresting me because, you're just part of the man, you're just keeping people down. Well, so they were saying, well, really, it's not my fault that I was doing something wrong. It's your fault for trying to keep me from living a better life. So instead of blaming themselves, they just, condemn the people that are telling them they did something wrong. 5 is an appeal to higher loyalties. And this is pretty easy to understand. Let's say someone beats up your friend, and you see that. And so then you go beat up that person, and you get in trouble for it. And you might give the justification that, hey, yeah, I beat him up, but he beat up my friend. And so my loyalty to avenging my friend's wrong was more important than maintaining the norm of society of not beating people up. And so you just appeal to a higher loyalty of some kind that justifies your behavior. So again, these are the kinds of techniques people engage in all kinds of circumstances to rationalize and justify their own behavior. And it was these kinds of techniques of neutralization that Sykes and Matza said would allow a person to detach themselves temporarily from the moral norms of society and justify their behavior without actually rejecting the norms of society. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Looking a little further into the research efforts of Sykes and Matza, one of the things they found was that juvenile delinquents weren't any more committed to their delinquency than they were to other conventional kinds of activities. So it wasn't, what they kind of were interested by is that delinquent kids weren't committed to this life of delinquency any more than they were committed to anything else. It was just kind of something they did every once in a while. And this is what they called drift. When basically, and just to simplify it, drift is just what it sounds like. Kids would just kind of drift in and out of delinquency based on a variety of circumstances and their ability to neutralize their behaviors. Again, essentially the idea here is that delinquents weren't these hardened criminals that this was all they lived for. It was just kind of something that they did every once in a while, and they would drift in and out of delinquency just kind of depending on the day and depending on what was going on. Some other things that Sykes and Matza talked about was the fact that because delinquency might involve doing things that are a little bit risky and might not be completely familiar to a person, you need more than just this idea of neutralization or a loss of control. They said you need more than that to explain it. That these were good ideas, but you need more than that. So they really had a couple of different things that they added to these ideas. One was preparation, and the definition of that there you can read. It's a process by which the person discovered that a given infraction could be pulled off, and that they could actually do it, and that the fear of being caught could be managed. So they just talked about this idea that people could prepare themselves for these kinds of things by convincing themselves that they could actually get away with it and that they could do it. The other concept they mixed with preparation was desperation. And this is kind of a fatalistic idea, but basically it's just this idea that you somehow get pressured into doing something that just makes you feel like you need to violate the rules of society, for some legitimate reason. And Sykes and Matza said that it was this combination of preparation and desperation that would create the will to offend. And then, once an offense actually occurred, it was these techniques of neutralization that a person would use to justify why they did what they did. Looking a little bit now at the context of control theory. These theories we've talked about so far were mostly developed in the 1950s. And if you go back and look at the history of the United States, the 1950s was a time where really pretty much everyone did what they were, not everyone, of course there were exceptions, but in general, society was marked by kind of this conformist type of attitude. You were supposed to go to school and get a job and work in the same job for 30 years and retire. And it was just kind of this time in our country's history where there was not really a lot of unrest. Everybody just kind of did what they were supposed to do for the most part. And so, in this time period, delinquency was seen as a really severe departure from the conventional order of things. The 1960s, however, were quite different and made control theory much more popular. If you are familiar at all with the 1960s, you will be familiar with the fact that it was a period of massive social change and a lot of social upheaval in our country at that time. You had the Vietnam War going on. There were a lot of people that were engaging in protests. There was kind of the hippie movement. You had the civil rights movement. It's kind of when the feminist movement was born. And so there were just a lot of things going on that would create a lot of forces for change in our society. And understanding this, the reason we're talking about it, is to help you to see how the political or social atmosphere in the country can actually influence, which kinds of theories are even talked about and developed, and subsequently how popular they are. This idea of control was really kind of the reason it was developed. This 1950s era where everything kind of was expected to just march along in good order. It kind of explains why a lot of people were focused on this idea of self-control and social control and belonging to society and conforming to norms. And then as the 1960s came around and the younger generation started departing from the social norm, a lot of that activity was explained in terms of this control theory, because people saw these movements and a lot of the criminal activity as just this massive departure from social and personal norms. A lot of people thought that the social turmoil that was going on in the 1960s really was kind of a collapse of the personal and social control, and so the nation was seen as being kind of sliding into this this era of high crime. But again, just keep in mind the social context. A lot of these theories that we talk about were developed decades ago, and so there might be some ideas that seem a little strange to us as we look through these theories, but if you look at them in the context of the times in which they were developed, they actually start to make a little more sense. But that's it for this chapter. So if you have questions about this, get in touch with me. In the next chapter, we're going to take a closer look at some of the more modern control theories that we actually still use for research today in the field of criminology. So I'll be talking to you soon. Have a good day.